Hey everybody, this is my EDCU 640 final project. For my inquiry project, I wanted to combine the topics in this class on alternative schooling and school choice with my profession, which is special education. And I wanted to look into the issue of school choice and disability access. I've spent my whole career in the public school sphere and now at the university, so I haven't had any personal experience working at choice schools to help students with disabilities. So I was pretty interested in the topic by and large. So before you start, clearly you found the video because you're watching this right now. What I wanted from this project is to have a simultaneous or a guided narration. So ideally I would like you to have either two tabs open. If you have two screens, you can use that, or you can adjust the windows. You can make this a little bit smaller and put this and the PowerPoint, or at least have access to be able to flip back and forth between both this video and the corresponding companion guide that goes with this project, because I want to talk about a few of the issues, but I also wanted to provide you a lot of primary sources and some links so that you could go and you can explore some of the source material a little bit deeper at your pleasure if you so desire. So I strongly suggest that you utilize the pause feature of this video if you would ever like to stop and take a look at some of the resources in more depth before moving forward. So as I said before, my focus of inquiry was how do school choice issues affect students with disabilities? Now this is an extremely multifaceted question. How would it affect access to choice schools? How would it affect funding sources? How would it affect the actual provision of services for students who are getting their education at a choice school as opposed to a traditional public school? And there's quite a few opinions on this matter that we hope to get into. But first, a little bit of foundation and history. When we're talking about school choice, in popular culture at least, we're referring to the Choice Scholarship Program, which sometimes is called the voucher program. And this, if you'd like to pause, you can actually take a look at this law. I have it right here linked, Indiana Code 20-51-4. This is the school choice scholarship legislation, and if you're interested, you can take a look at it and look through it. There's a couple of specific things that I wanted to note in this piece of legislation, specifically having to do with students with disabilities. First, we have a discrimination policy here, which is IC 20-51-4-3, which says that if schools do accept vouchers and the amount of vouchers that they can accept exceed the amount of voucher spaces available, acceptance needs to be on a random lottery, and there is a state auditing commission that goes around and actually checks and spot checks some of the schools to make sure that they are doing this. And although this might be somewhat of an afterthought, in IC 20-51-4-4.5, you see that we put in emergency measures to make sure that we are providing educational opportunities for students who receive special education services in choice schools. Now you can see that although it does say that we should provide services, it doesn't necessarily get into too many details in these couple paragraphs, in paragraphs A, B, and C. So this is one of the issues in our debate, whereas when the rubber meets the road,
because the expression is kind of like where are the results? Where's the beef, if you will? Another opportunity for you to look at some state-by-state comparisons, so you can see Indiana compared to other states. You can see how certain school choice laws vary from state to state. Certain states have special education protections written in. Some states are silent. Some states have certain stipulations that exempt choice schools from certain accountability or legislation. So if you're interested, take a look at that. So one of the major issues in school choice is the idea of eligibility and access. Now in Indiana, we're revolved around these three specific sub-components of eligibility. First, the idea of income, and income is based on the threshold for federal free and reduced lunch. I believe 200% is the cutoff for the school choice voucher, and there's also 150% for another cutoff. A disability status, if a child has an IEP, that makes them eligible for school choice. And then also, if the child has a failing neighborhood school, that child is also eligible for some school choice initiatives. Now, like we said earlier, the hot button is the school choice scholarship or the voucher, but that's actually only one of several school choice initiatives that Indiana has in place. And I encourage you, if you want to pause the video and take a look at some of the differences and the nuances between the school voucher program and the scholarships or tax credit program and the private/homeschool tax deduction, because the eligibilities are all unique, and the availability is also unique to each program. So the voucher, like I say, is eligible for students with IEPs, students in failing districts, and students who are under income level. Now that's about $4,500 a year, plus or minus a few dollars. Tax credit has for, once again, for students that are under a specific income level, they could qualify for that. And that's a little under $2,000 as a tax credit. And then lastly, we have this private homeschool tax deduction, and that's $1,000 for any person or any family that has a child enrolled in either a private school or a homeschool. So you can see that there's a few different ways that the government wants to give people money for school choice. So I encourage you, if you want to pause the video and take a look at any of these three programs, if you haven't had the chance to take a look at them for yourself. So, into the debate, school choice and students with disabilities in special education. On the debate, you're going to find two sides, and for the most part, the sides agree on their talking points and on their positions. So the two sides are the parent advocates and school choice advocates. Then sometimes I guess you could refer to the parent advocates as pro-traditional school advocates as well. But as you'll see, many of the people and the resources are from actual parent organizations and parent advocacy groups and things like that. So people who are advocates of traditional public schools, or who are against the idea of school choice. First thing is that people say that parents give up their rights to due process if they enroll in a voucher program. Parent advocates also say that schools can be exclusive in their admissions process, and they could potentially restrict or discriminate against students with disabilities. Third, insufficient funds for services. When students leave the public system, there's a lot of money that floats around. Some of that is from state funding, and that's where we talk about that $4,500 voucher from the state and the tax credits and things like that. When students with disabilities are put into the mix, that takes a unique turn because, according to the child count every year, each student with a disability that has an IEP has a certain price tag that comes along with them. That's funds that's guaranteed to this public school that's providing services for them. Now, depending on the state, the transference of that money and the provision of services can be altered with school choice programs. Whereas if you are in a school that does not participate on the level that services are required, that leads to access issues for the particular student. And then lastly, parents argue that teachers are not prepared and have low awareness in general when working with students with disabilities. Now, as a person that teaches special ed at the university level, I can somewhat attest to that. Like, for example, our elementary ed majors, the K through 6 licensed people, out of their 120-hour degree program, they take one class on working with students with disabilities in the general ed classroom. I know because I teach that at Special Ed 302. Now that's one class out of 40 that they take at the university. So about 3% of their overall training is going to make up somewhere between 15 and 20% of the students that make up the class. And from someone who has a special ed degree, I felt as though I had so much to learn after 4 years of special ed training. To only have one class and some very fleeting experiences, that's going to lead to a rough learning curve when you actually get out and you have unique problems that you have to deal with in the classroom. So, on the other side of this argument are the school choice advocates, people who say that school choice can be good for students with disabilities. First is that specialized schools can provide more specialized curriculum for students. The practical example of this in Indianapolis is the Hudson Academy. We also have the Indiana School for the Blind and School for the Deaf, although I wouldn't classify those as school choice schools. I would classify them as alternative schools because you have multi-district integration, and it's a special education school, which, at least in my opinion, falls under alternative school, that they could provide specific curriculum that's tailored to students who are deaf, students who are blind. The Fortune Academy or Hudson Academy, that was specifically an Orton Gillingham-centered school for people with learning disabilities. So when we don't have to conform to the bureaucracy and the curriculum mapping and the standardization and rigidity of the public school model, we can create unique curricular experiences that can reach students with specific learning needs. Next, choice provides more access and mobility. And this is one of the simple truths of, or at least the simple arguments of school choice, where if you can choose, then you can either go to a new school or you can stay at your current school. And depending on the level of choice you can potentially have multiple schools to choose from. Now, once again, we'll talk about both sides of that argument in a minute. Access isn't always an issue. Sometimes you can play games with who gets let in, who doesn't get let in. Yes, but the idea of some choice over no choice is more choice than you would otherwise have. So for people that would benefit and could access that services, that would be better, at least theoretically. Next, eligibility favors students with disabilities, especially in Indiana. That provides you much quicker access to that school choice scholarship. So if a child or if a school is not providing good services for a child within their needs, that parent has a lot of power because they can pick their child up and they can put them in a different school that could help their child better. If a school is going to treat a child negatively or not provide for them as to their need, then they don't deserve to be there. So the school choice would, at least in theory, allow that student with a disability to receive, or at least have the opportunity to receive, services in a different environment. And then lastly, this idea of being able to work outside the traditional public school paradigm. And this can be for certain curriculum programs, for certain standards, like we talked about the Fortune Academy and School for Blind, School for the Deaf, a specialized curriculum to meet specific learning styles or to help compensate for specific deficits. That can play a huge role in the environment, in the curriculum, in the instruction, and schools that are specialized can provide that. Now, of course, there's downsides to specialized schools as well. From someone who, as a professional, is very much a mainstream advocate, the idea of special schools for students with specific disabilities is, something that you have to take with a cautious consideration, because the idea of the least restrictive environment is the idea that students are placed with other students without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. So anyways, a little more depth into some of the arguments. The Council for Exceptional Children is the parent group of special education. For example, all special ed classes at Ball State are aligned to CEC standards. And CEC's position statement is that parents of students with disabilities can give up their rights to voucher programs in certain situations. Now, once again, we have private schools, okay, which can select who is being allowed in, who isn't being allowed in, and also even before school choice, private schools did not have the same infrastructure to serve students with disabilities as the public schools. There may be a resource setting, and there's this idea of low-cost disability, which we'll cover in a second. But students that can be served without a whole lot of resources were usually able to get along okay, whereas if there is a more serious mobility or things that required structural or other sorts of cost-intensive modifications, then you might start getting into access or admission issues. Also, another thing that CEC noted, and I do encourage you, if you want to take a look through and click the link and take a look through their position statement. It's really interesting. Also, one thing in their due process for behavior is this idea of manifestation determination, which has to do with change of placement. Sometimes, depending on state rules, if students enter into a private school, they have entered into a completely separate and unaccountable discipline system that's separate from the public schools. And the phenomena that the CEC talks about is this idea of a school accepting a student and basically taking their voucher check, and then through, I guess, somewhere ranging from legitimate to illegitimate means, expelling or disciplining a child and sending the child back to their home placement, but still having benefited from their voucher. So the CEC noted that as a practice as well that need to be wary of. So the long story short about CEC is you need to check your state laws on special education, and that's going to determine your eligibility and what sort of rights parents have or waive when accepting vouchers. Another major argument is the idea that public schools have developed a history of providing services to people with disabilities. And this is a position statement from the National Council on Disability, which is from the Department of Education. So special education started back in the early 70s, and since then, people like myself have been working in the field to try to advance and progress and give better services to students with disabilities.
Now, public schools have had to provide those services on all ranges of the spectrum, from mild to severe. In many cases, private or charter schools have very limited experience working with students with disabilities. Now, once again, we have this idea of low-cost disability, and if you look at a chart, some of the top disabilities are very minor, easily mainstream disabilities. That's specific learning disabilities is about half. Okay, you also have speech and language related issues. That's about another 20%. Then you have attention deficit hyperactivity. That makes up another, 10. Or in other health impairments, among other things, other health impairments makes up about 10% of students with disabilities. So of those three main disabilities, we're talking about 75-ish% of students with, now granted that all disabilities have degrees of severity from extremely minor to extremely severe, and some people have better coping and better skills that they've developed than others. But for all intents and purposes, the vast majority of those people with specific learning disabilities, speech and language, other health impairments, which is ADHD, can and do succeed in a fully mainstreamed environment with some minimal supports. This might just be things like time. It's non-monetary resources, planning, anticipation, specific strategies. None of those things really cost any money, but they help the student out so much that they can participate. So public schools have spent 40 years working on this and trying to improve and make special education better. And the position, at least that the National Council on Disability says, is that the private schools are people that don't have the same amount of experience or somewhat out of their depth. Now, as a counter argument, I would say that we're talking about the present as opposed to the future. I have a problem with this argument because look at, let's say, like a football team. A bad football team can go out and they can bring in a bunch of new people, and they can make, with more experience, that are better if they're willing to go out and pay and find the people, and they can make their team better. I don't see why this is any different for choice schools. If choice schools are really interested in implementing programs, I'm sure that they can go out and recruit former special ed, current special ed professionals to come in and bring their years of knowledge to that particular school and help develop a program without them having to reinvent the wheel. So, for whatever that's worth, I think there's two sides to that particular point. The last parent advocate point that I wanted to talk about in depth was this idea that most voucher programs permit schools to discriminate, and that students don't have to accept students with disabilities. And this is the National Coalition on Public Education. And this goes along with the idea of students and parents giving up their rights when they do enter into voucher programs. And once again, this really does depends on state law. For example, in Indiana, we have those couple of vague paragraphs where it says that we want to take measures to provide reasonable accommodations for students with disabilities, but the issue with that is, what is the line for reasonable accommodation? Again, many schools could accept about 75% of all students with disabilities because, by and large, their disabilities are very minor and easily accommodated with a few supports that are very low or zero cost. And very low resource in terms of planning and preparation. Where reasonable accommodation comes in is, to what extent would they ask a fledgling Catholic, poor Catholic school. I went to Catholic school. We never really had a ton of money. At least the school. Would they have to do something to their old building from like the 1930s to put in an elevator for a student in a wheelchair? Or, to what extent are the accommodations reasonable, and at what extent can or cannot a private school provide
adequate services for students with certain specific disabilities? That's a very tenuous question, and it's probably something that's going to be fought in various court cases as the situations arise. But at least in special education law, um, I'm thinking of like Rowley. I'm thinking of like Timothy W. If you guys, you can just Google either of those and find them, where courts are inclined to have a somewhat of a fair-minded idea of reasonable, whereas if you're changing or you're making extreme modifications, especially to like structures, and you can produce substantial financial burden and other sorts of burdens. Courts have had a pretty good record in ruling in favor for schools under this idea of reasonable versus optimal. That's something that we teach in special education, the idea of reasonable accommodations versus optimal accommodations. So anyway, some major counterpoints. The first thing that everybody should be aware of is this study out of McKay, Florida, from the Manhattan Institute. And this is for people that are very big school choice advocates. This might be one of the first things that they pull out because it was very common in at least my research for this project. Basically, McKay, Florida residents allowed students with disabilities to go to private or charter schools, and they had a pretty deregulated school voucher program where their parents had quite a bit of choice in where students were sent. And so this Manhattan Institute did a bunch of data collection after this plan had been implemented, and they did some parent surveys. If you want, so I encourage you to pause the video or at least click on this and take a look at some of these stats. One of the findings, at least from parent satisfaction, was that they, at the beginning of the study, they said that 30% parents were satisfied with the special education services in public schools, whereas after the school choice, 86% of parents said that they were satisfied with the special education services that they were receiving at a choice school. So that's, going from 30% approval to 86% approval. So a lot of people use this particular argument as a counterpoint to the, it doesn't help kids. School choice is actually bad for students with disabilities. This is one of the more primary counterpoints to the anti-choice argument. Also, another stat on the McKay, Florida, if you take a look in the link, that you said that after the program had been implemented for a couple of years, they did a survey, and overall, including all students in the area, parents had a 90% overall positive feedback experience rating for the voucher program in McKay schools. So pretty overwhelming positive support and results from that particular instance. Another big pro-choice argument is this idea that many public schools don't adequately serve students with disabilities. And there is something to be said about that. We can go and we can look at the McKay, Florida data by itself, and you could say that in the public school system there's 30% of parents that were happy with the services that their students were getting. Now that's in the traditional setting. I'm not saying that that's a standard number across the country, but there are many instances where students with disabilities do not get the quality or care of service in their school districts that they deserve. And you can just look at the stacks feet high of due process hearings that happen every day across America from parents that are filing complaints against special ed cooperatives, saying that either their rights have been violated, services weren't provided, or any of a number of things that parents have due process rights to air their grievances over. Which is a good thing. If we're not doing what we need to do for the kids, the parents should have that right to stand up and to ask for accountability, right? That's a good thing. And this is actually a cool video, and if you want, I actually recommend you pause and just take a look at it. And this is Jake Olson, and he made like ESPN. He's the long snapper for the USC Trojans football team, and is blind, and has actually long snapped 3 regulation extra points in his career, and also is like a golfer and things like that. And he was sharing his personal experience where, even in very good districts, because he's in Orange County, that sometimes there can be a stigma even in good districts of students with disabilities, and if people are very competitive or very test score centric, especially about AP classes or more advanced track academic options, there have been instances where students with disabilities have been systematically segregated from those environments. And a personal experience from a student that I know is that they wanted to take advanced calculus or anything like that, but they needed some help for alternative formatting for a sensory disability. And what it came down to is that the resource teacher was not a calculus teacher, and the resource teacher couldn't do... Okay, so the resource teacher didn't have the calculus skills, and the calculus teacher didn't have the special ed skills, and neither of the teachers had the collaboration skills to work together, so they just said, hey, why don't you just take stats? Or, they basically tried to shoehorn the student into a different class. Now, this isn't a traditional public school. This isn't in, like a choice school or something like that. In support of choice schools, I will say one thing about the economics of that, is that schools want more students, okay? Because more students means more money. There's an economic incentive to take students. Many students with disabilities, once again, exist and have a very minor disability. Remember, disabilities exist in a spectrum from extremely minor, this is called invisible disabilities, to extremely severe and apparent disabilities, okay? And between learning disabilities, speech and language disabilities, and attention deficit, hyperactivity, of those 3, a large percentage are extremely mild cases, or at least mainstreamable. That's a majority of students with IEPs that can and should be in at full-time, or at least very, very majority full-time, maybe access to a resource room or something like that. But other than that, full-time students, if not completely full-time students. So, once again, those schools can provide services for those students at very low or no cost. Secondly, school community has reputation for providing services as well, especially, let's say, like in Catholic schools. They would, there's a moral and an ethical incentive to provide resource services. In our parish community, I don't think the elders would have thought to not allow or to not have a special ed resource, because between the elders and the community higher ups, disability has affected enough people, 15 to 20% of students having a disability. If it doesn't affect you, it affects you within 1 degree of separation. So there's a pretty high awareness, and to facilitate a good parish community, many schools want to have special resource facilities. Although they don't have the money to have all the big expensive technology, they can certainly provide the low and no cost situation. So what are some research takeaways? Council on Parent Attorneys and Advocates looked at this issue in depth, and they came away with some observations. And if you want to take a look at the full text, you can click on this link at the bottom of this slide. So first thing they said about voucher programs in general is that parents often choose a voucher regardless of the availability and civil rights protection because of their child needing to change schools. If parents are reporting an urgency to need to change schools. I mean, that is a violently negative relationship that that parent is having with that school. The fact where a parent feels as though they need to get their child out of there speaks at least to the need for some sort of solution, be it choice or something else. Next, parents like knowing that they can explore their options with vouchers even if they end up keeping their child in the same school. So like I said, some choice is better than no choice. So if you can get your child access to some choice, even if you don't use it, it is a right that's being protected and accessed by people that are eligible for it. So, that's, once again, something is better than nothing in all circumstances. Next, little data supports the either benefit or loss of rights and idea. Once again, we have things like the McKay school district thing coming out, but the idea of the gray area between special ed law and private and non-public schools is something that absolutely has to be addressed for vouchers to reach a more perfect state of existence, if you will. And we'll talk about that more in a second. Next, some schools accept students with disabilities and then expel them for behaviors. This is kind of the old grab the check and send back technique that we talked about, that the CEC talked about a little bit as well, that some students with disabilities exhibit certain behaviors, and that's why we have in IDEA the idea of manifestation determination, where we have to have a meeting before we do a placement change. That's just a due process right that that child has to protect them and to keep them in their placement. Lastly, special education voucher systems have a hard time including all students with disabilities. Yes, that is true. Okay, but I guess the counterpoint that I would again bring up to that is that, once again, looking at the disabilities that are being accounted for in schools, between mild learning disabilities, mild autism like Asperger's, okay, attention deficit disorder, speech and language issues, we're talking about a very high percentage, or the majority of students with IEPs in the United States that can succeed and should succeed with full mainstreaming, possibly with a little bit of resource time or pull-out time for some sort of specific targeted intervention. This goes back to reasonable versus optimal accommodations. If a person has serious medical and nursing issues, then a school would have to rebuild, a choice school would have to rebuild a large percentage of their infrastructure to accommodate that student. That, at least according to court law history, would most likely be ruled an unreasonable accommodation. Rebuild your school for my one child. No, if we can get a ramp or if we can do something that's reasonable to get that person in, yes, but reasonable is not optimal. And then last, the idea that we need more data to show whether voucher programs are effective. Now, this is where our McKay information comes in, and that's why a lot of the pro-choice advocates really hit hard on this particular case in McKay, Florida, because one of the main criticisms of school vouchers is that we don't necessarily know if they work or not. And McKay is an example of, at least according to the position of the people who use it as a talking point, McKay was, in their opinion, a successful implementation of voucher programs and could be used as models other places. So that, it's not there, but it's on its way. So what are some things that we can do to address school choice and students with disabilities? Just a few things, even outside of the research, as a professional, my own personal reflections as a special education professional. First idea is this argument of federal dollars in Section 504. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act prevents discrimination against people with disabilities, and the key word is coming up here, that receive federal dollars. So any organization that receives federal dollars can't discriminate based on disability. Now, Section 504 is a different law than the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, whereas that's a more specific law, and Section 504 protects a wider range of people than IDEA does. But still, I am interested in how 504 has not been used in a lawsuit against a access issue in a school choice program. Because if a student has a disability, then they're getting federal dollars from the child count for services provided to that child. Now, if those dollars in some programs end up being transferred to the choice school for the provision of special ed services, then, at least in my own argument, is that's federal dollars. And according to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, IDEA aside, according to Section 504, any organization that receives federal dollars can't discriminate based on disability, which opens up a huge Pandora's box, including things like access and admissions. So that's a big issue that I think has yet to be sorted out in court, and it'll be interesting if it finally does get there. Next, regulation of participating choice schools. In many instances that the research that we just looked at had been reporting, many participating schools have some or a lot of leeway in who they accept, how they accept, services to provide, curriculum, qualification of teachers. Many charter schools have a lot of wiggle room and a lot of freedom to work outside of government boundaries. That's good in the theoretical concept of that's kind of what charter schools are doing. It's an alternative to the traditional public school and needs to work outside of its paradigm. But if they are doing so at the detriment of students with disabilities, is that a civil rights violation? If a voucher is a right, then is utilization of that voucher an equal right? And where? And what places are exempt because private, religious, or otherwise? And once again, this goes back to the idea of you are receiving federal dollars, but maybe, or state dollars, but don't have to apply to state standards. That's one of the major detraction points, and rightfully so. Next, fully funding IDEA. This is something that the Council of Exceptional Children noted, whereas their hypothesis is that although IDEA has been authorized as a law in appropriation, it has never been fully funded to the extent that the original policymakers designed to have it funded. So, at least in the idea of the CEC, if we can fully fund IDEA, then there would be less incentive for students to want to receive alternative schooling because they would have a more well-funded resource base in their traditional school placement. Next, the idea of early intervention. This has nothing to do with school choice or special education in that general, but there are stacks of research that show that the more early intervention programs that there are, the major reduction of special education services needed later on. This is especially true, once again, with speech and language, communication, and specific learning disabilities. If we can teach compensatory skills very early on, kids can have more practice using them, and they can ultimately be better at it at a younger age. And then lastly, this idea of improving public schools. The McKay, Florida data is hard to deny. 30% of McKay, Florida parents were satisfied with special education services that their children were receiving. I'm not saying that that's a national average, but there are, across boundaries, there is a general dissatisfaction from a significant percentage of parents with students with disabilities, especially in struggling districts that feel that their students are not being adequately represented and they're not being adequately served. If we go back to one slide ago, to the findings from the Council of the Parent Attorneys and Advocates, one of their findings was that parents were accessing vouchers because, one, they felt that they absolutely had to get out of a particular school environment because of how bad the experience was for their child. And secondly, they were accessing vouchers just because, that did give them that extra right and that extra resource if they did so decide to use it. And the ultimate point is, if parents were happy with their public school experience, then why would they have the need to access the alternative school services? So in summation, why does school choice even exist in the first place? Why do we need to have this conversation? Why are we having this conversation? And the ultimate answer is there's demand for it. Parents want alternatives to our current public school model. As long as parents still want, as long as parents still want an alternative and are dissatisfied with the public school experience, there will always be a demand for alternative schools. This is no different for students with disabilities. As long as students with disabilities feel as though they're not being adequately represented or adequately served, especially in struggling districts, there will always be that desire to get another alternative option and receive educational services somewhere else. It's like grass is always greener, better by comparison. So it's there because parents want it, okay, and to a certain extent that they feel that they need it. And going back to the policy findings, that many parents needed a voucher so they could get out, quickly of their situation because it was so negative. So that's going to take a few things. First, we have to understand that there are issues in the traditional public school paradigm. It's not a fault, it's not a blame, it's an observation. It's not individual teachers' faults, it's not even individual administrators' faults. Although there are good schools and good bad schools, there are good administrators and bad, there are good teachers and bad. Across the entire system, we can do considerably better in providing services, immersive and inclusive services for students with disabilities. And until we can do that, there will always be parents looking for another option, whatever it is. So thank you for joining me for this look into the issue of school choice and access for students with disabilities. I appreciate you spending this time with me, and have a good day.